The page is brittle, not fragile the way old things get when they dry out, but brittle the way things get when no one has turned to them in a long time. It sits in the middle of a bound volume, cloth-covered, spine cracked, catalogued once in 1931, and apparently not requested again until the early 2000s. The volume is a final engineering report filed by the Department of Construction for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, completed in the winter of 1894 and covering every system: water, drainage, sewerage, electrical conduit, structural grading, that served the fairgrounds from May through October of 1893. Most of the report is exactly what you would expect: tonnage figures, contract numbers, pipe diameters, the names of foremen. But on page 214, set inside a paragraph about subsurface drainage, there is a single sentence that does not behave the way the rest of the document behaves. And once you read it, every photograph of the White City looks slightly different. The sentence is easy to miss. It does not announce itself. It refers, in plain technical language, to a drainage infrastructure encountered during excavation, not installed by the exposition's own engineers, but already present in the ground when they arrived. The line describes a subsurface system, partially serviceable and of unknown origin, predating any recorded improvement to the site. The engineers did not build it. They found it, and rather than investigate its provenance, they incorporated it. They connected their new system to the old one, noted the junction in a single clause, and moved on. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what Jackson Park was supposed to be before it became the most celebrated construction site of the 19th century. In 1871, Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux were commissioned to turn a stretch of marshy lakefront into a public pleasure ground. The terrain was poor, sandy ridges alternating with waterlogged swales, the whole thing subject to fluctuations in Lake Michigan's water level that could shift by as much as 4 feet between years. Olmsted's plan proposed using dredging boats to reopen old lagoons, piling the excavated material onto the ridges to create usable high ground. It was an elegant idea, and almost none of it was carried out. By the time Chicago won the right to host the 1893 exposition, Jackson Park remained, in Olmsted's own words, the least park-like ground within miles of the city. The landscape work had barely begun. The drainage had not been completed. The grading existed mostly on paper. This is the accepted timeline, and it is not wrong. But it leaves an awkward question sitting in the middle of the engineering record. If the park had never been properly improved, if the drainage system Olmsted proposed had never been built, then what exactly did the exposition's engineers find already in the ground when they began digging in 1891? The report does not answer the question. It does not even seem interested in it. The engineers were working against a deadline so compressed that it bordered on the absurd. Congress had mandated that the exposition open on May 1st, 1893. When the architects first visited the site on January 10, 1891, they had 27 and a half months to transform a swamp into a functioning city of 200 buildings, complete with electrical service, pressurized water, sewage treatment, and an intramural railway. The foremen were not archaeologists. When they hit a functional pipe where no pipe should have been, they used it. This is the part of the story that most histories skip, not because they are hiding anything, but because it does not fit inside the narrative frame that makes the exposition comprehensible. The standard account of the White City is a story of human will overcoming impossible conditions, Daniel Burnham's organizational genius, the labor of thousands, the rivalry between architects. It is a triumph narrative. And triumph narratives do not have room for the detail that some of the infrastructure was already there. That detail introduces ambiguity where the story needs certainty. So it was filed, cataloged, and forgotten. One man's experience makes the pattern tangible. Edward Shankland was the structural engineer responsible for the Manufactures and Liberal Arts Building, which at the time of its completion was the largest roofed structure on Earth. Shanklin's private correspondence, preserved at the Chicago History Museum, contains a letter to a colleague in New York, written in November 1891. In it, he describes what he calls an unexpected convenience, ground conditions at the southern end of the site that were rather better prepared than we had reason to anticipate. He does not elaborate. He does not describe what he found. He treats it the same way the official report would treat it 3 years later, as a fortunate accident unworthy of further investigation. Shanklin's building went up. It stood through a brutal Lake Michigan winter, and his letters slipped into an archive where it sat, unremarked, for more than a century. The institutional behavior around this detail follows a pattern that is older than Chicago. When a construction project encounters something in the ground that does not match its planning documents, the project has two options. It can stop and investigate, which costs time, or it can absorb the anomaly into its own system and move forward. Under normal conditions, investigation is reasonable. Under deadline pressure, and the exposition operated under the most extreme construction deadline in American history to that point, absorption is inevitable. The structure does not suppress the information. It metabolizes it. The anomaly becomes part of the system, and in becoming part of the system, it loses its identity as an anomaly. It becomes just another pipe, just another graded surface, just another fortunate coincidence that made the impossible schedule slightly less impossible. This is not unique to the exposition. The same institutional metabolism appears in the construction records of the London Underground, where engineers building the Metropolitan Railway in the 1860s repeatedly documented encounters with older tunneling and brickwork that did not correspond to any known construction project. The same pattern surfaces in Rome, where every significant excavation since the Renaissance has turned up infrastructure that belongs to no documented phase of the city's development. And it appears in the construction logs of the Paris Metro, where engineers in the early 1900s noted subsurface vaulting along certain routes that they attributed without evidence to medieval cellars, and then built their stations around them. In each case, the response is identical. The anomaly is noted, it is not investigated, it is incorporated. And the project moves forward, because the project must move forward. What emerges from this is not a mystery. It is something more uncomfortable than a mystery. It is a recognition that the ground beneath modern infrastructure is not as well documented as the institutions that manage it would prefer. The assumption embedded in every engineering project is that the subsurface conditions are either natural or the product of recorded human activity. When a third category appears, functional infrastructure with no corresponding record, the assumption does not update. The project simply recategorizes the anomaly. It becomes prior improvement. It becomes legacy infrastructure. It becomes a line in a report that nobody reads twice. The strongest counter-argument to this entire line of observation is straightforward and deserves serious consideration. Chicago in the 1880s and 1890s was a city of relentless, overlapping construction. The Great Fire of 1871 had leveled the center, and the subsequent rebuilding was chaotic, poorly documented, and often conducted by small contractors who kept no records that survived. Jackson Park sat at the edge of this activity. It is entirely plausible, and most historians would say probable, that whatever the exposition engineers found in the ground was simply the remnant of a forgotten improvement project from the 1870s or 1880s. Perhaps a partial execution of Olmsted's original plan by a crew whose paperwork was lost in the institutional turnover that followed the fire. There is no need to invoke anything exotic. The mundane explanation, a lost record, a forgotten crew, a contract that was filed and then misfiled, is almost certainly sufficient. And yet, the structural observation holds, even if the mundane explanation is correct, because the point is not what was in the ground. The point is what happened to the information about what was in the ground. A functioning system was discovered. It was absorbed. The discovery was compressed into a single line in a document that would not be read for 100 years. And the story that was told about the exposition, the story of impossible construction, completed through sheer force of will, proceeded as though the ground had been blank when the builders arrived. This is the pattern. Not the thing in the ground, but the thing that happens to knowledge when it threatens the coherence of an institutional narrative. The information is not destroyed, it is not hidden, it is demoted. It is placed in a location within the record where it is technically accessible but practically invisible, a single line on page 214, surrounded by pike diameters and contract numbers, in a volume that no one has requested since 1931. Every major construction project in modern history carries within its documentation a thin layer of these demoted facts. They are not secrets. They are not cover-ups. They are the natural product of institutions that must move forward, that must produce coherent narratives, and that must treat the ground beneath them as knowable. When the ground turns out to be more complicated than the narrative allows, the complication is not suppressed. It is simply filed in the one place where filing and forgetting become indistinguishable. The exposition closed on October 30th, 1893. Within a year, most of the buildings had been demolished or destroyed by fire. The lagoons were left. The underground systems were left. Jackson Park returned to its role as a public ground, built now on layers that included Olmsted's incomplete 1871 plan, the unexplained infrastructure the exposition engineers had found, and the exposition's own systems, all of it tangled together beneath the grass, no longer distinguishable as separate histories. Page 214 is still there. The sentence has not been redacted or removed. It sits exactly where the engineer placed it, in exactly the language he chose, saying exactly what it says. The information was never hidden. It was simply never promoted to the version of the story that anyone decided to tell.